Greetings from Columbia Business School, Executive Education. My name is Scott Gardner, and I'm here today with Professor Pierre Yared for today's webinar, Macroeconomic Consequences of the COVID-19 Pandemic. Before I introduce Pierre, I'd like to just go over a few quick logistics. If you'll see on your screen right now, a recording of this webinar will be sent to you. If you'd like to tweet about this webinar, please do so at hashtag CBSExecEd. And finally, most importantly, please submit those questions to the Q&A box. We'll get to as many of those as possible in the last 10 minutes. It's my pleasure to introduce Pierre Yared. He is the MUTB Professor of International Business at Columbia Business School. His research, which has been published in leading academic journals, focuses on macroeconomic policy, political economy, and growth. He is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and an associate editor of the American Economic Review. Yared teaches Global Economic Environment, a core MBA course in the macroeconomics for which he received the Dean's Award for Teaching Excellence. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Economic Club of New York. He received his AB in economics from Harvard University and his PhD in economics from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is also the faculty director of the upcoming online class this March, Global Strategy. Pierre, it's great to be with you today.
Great to be here as well. Thank you, Scott.
So I'm going to leave you to the stage and I will rejoin you in the last 10 minutes for Q&A.
Wonderful. So welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. We have about 20 minutes and then we're going to do the Q&A. Let me give you a sense of what I'll be covering. I'll first discuss why this recession is different. Then we'll talk a little bit about some of the government responses across the world and then some of the long-term implications. So there are basically 5 reasons why this is a different recession than the different types of various recessions we've been experiencing. And you can think about it in terms of your own business as well. 2 things have happened during this recession as a consequence of mandated social distancing as well as people choosing to do social distancing on their own. First, people's consumption has changed, and second, employment has changed. And one way to think about this is in terms of consumption that can be easily socially distanced and consumption that cannot be easily socially distanced. That's on the what you see there on the y-axis. And you can also think about employment that can be easily socially distanced versus employment that cannot be easily socially distanced. And what I've described here are different product categories that would fit in each. You could see, for example, gaming is a sector where both employment and consumption can be socially distanced. Barbershops is the direct opposite, where both employees and consumers can't meet. And then what you have, which is interesting in the other quadrants, for example, in the top right, you have manufactured goods, things like Peloton bikes, where people want to buy them. They can use these goods at home, but they're very difficult to produce, at least at the same capacity as before. In contrast, if you think about train travel or air travel, it's relatively straightforward to put the employees far apart and socially distance them. Like the airline pilot, for example. However, the consumers themselves cannot be socially distanced. Part of the reason I'm showing you this is because this is unique to this recession. Basically, what this means is that some businesses expand, some businesses contract, and also it has different implications for prices and inflation. So let me describe that for a minute. If you look across these sectors, what you see is that the largest economic relative expansion has been for the ones in the top left quadrant, where you see, for example, software publishers have an increase in employment. The largest economic contraction is in the bottom right. And that basically means that it's possible that once the pandemic ends, that you see a reversal there, which is something to think about. In addition, many of us have been wondering about inflation and when it will pick up. What's interesting is that we actually see plenty of inflation, in particular in the top right quadrant, where you see that employment is not at capacity, but there's plenty of demand. There we see plenty of inflation. In contrast, if employment can be socially distanced, but there's not a lot of consumption, like for airlines, or train travel, there you see large deflation. So, I'm mentioning this because this is unique to this recession, the fact that there's such heterogeneous impact across sectors. And one thing to consider is to what extent are these patterns here to stay, or will they be completely reversed once we go back to normal? A second major difference relative to previous recessions is the extent to which everything has been synchronized, both across sectors. This is across sectors in the US economy, what you could see here with the perfectly synchronized spike last March, where you see expansions and contractions. And more, not just across sectors, but also across countries. You can compare this, for example, to the global financial crisis, where it began with stress in the subprime mortgage market, became stress in the financial market, then became stress in the real economy, focusing principally on the US, and then eventually spilled over into Europe and emerging markets. That process took many, many months. In contrast, what we see here is something that's very much synchronized across sectors and across countries. A third difference, which we can now see taking place in many countries, for example, in the UK, is the possibility for multiple dips. And the reason why we can have multiple dips is because of the fact that it depends on lockdowns and social distancing, and we can have different waves of social distancing causing different waves of GDP declines, which is what you could see here, given the current situation of the UK going back into a second recession. An additional difference is the fact that, in contrast to previous recessions, there is a potential for a complete eradication of the cause, namely by vaccination. And what you could see here is the speed at which this is taking place across different countries, with some of the countries in the Middle East ahead of everyone else in terms of the speed of vaccination in per capita terms. Why do I mention this? If you consider, say, the subprime mortgage crisis, it took years to clean up the balance sheets of the failing financial institutions. Whereas in contrast here, we have the potential for actually eradicating the underlying cause very quickly. So we can imagine a rapid bounce back. And in fact, some of the more recent forecasts that we see from places like Goldman Sachs, for example, have been more optimistic. And the final difference that I want to mention is that this recession has similarities to the global financial crisis, but also some differences. So the typical recession does not involve a financial crisis. A typical recession would be like the 2001 bursting of the dot-com bubble, which was short, lasted 8 months, and did not involve a long-term deterioration of the economy. Financial crises, on the other hand, are much more severe and much more prolonged. And the reason is that what happens is that financial stress transmits into the real economy, and then problems in the real economy transmit and become financial stress. What the pandemic has the potential to do is to create a financial crisis, which can explain in your mind why government policies have been so aggressive. So because of the severity of the recession, where what we are seeing are the most intense economic declines since World War II across countries, because of the severity of the recession, as well as the possibility of it being prolonged, what we have the risk of experiencing is a financial crisis caused by stress in the real economy, caused by a wave of bankruptcies. For example, brick and mortar businesses, commercial real estate, airlines. If all of them go bankrupt simultaneously, that would add stress to the financial system, and then financial institutions themselves might fail. And then that failure of financial institutions can lead to a financial crisis, leading to a further economic contraction. So that's a fifth difference to take into account. So what have governments done? This is an overview of what a lot of countries have done. Many of them have taken interest rates to zero. But some of them have taken them into negative territory, such as Euro area and Japan, where they were negative to begin with. many central banks have expanded the speed of quantitative easing. Quantitative easing in the case of the U.S. Has been so much more rapid and aggressive than it was in the global financial crisis. At one point, the U.S. Fed was buying not that much less than over the course of a day than it was buying over the course of a month in the global financial crisis, for example. Central banks have also expanded the set of assets that they are buying, for example, intervening in the corporate bond market, in the case of the US in particular, and also intervening in other types of markets. One of them that's not listed here, for example, is the municipal bond market in the case of the US, which might be something interesting to look at in the foreseeable future when states and localities come under more and more fiscal stress in the aftermath of the pandemic. Which leads me to my second main intervention, which has been fiscal, because of the fact that central banks have been limited in providing a cushion for the economy because of zero interest rates. What we've seen are very aggressive fiscal interventions. The advantage of fiscal interventions is that they can be targeted, and also they can put the taxpayer money to work, future taxpayer money to work. In some ways, we shouldn't be thinking about this appropriately as a stimulus, because the goal of these policies was not to actually stimulate the economy. The goal of these policies was to provide liquidity so that we would not turn a pandemic-driven social distancing recession into a financial crisis. So that's why what we see here relative to the global financial crisis is direct payments, both to companies and to households. The idea is that with these payments, they can continue to afford their bills, go into a coma, so that once the coma is over and the vaccine is widely distributed, there are no prolonged after effects from a wave of defaults and bankruptcies. So that's kind of the right way to think about the fiscal interventions. It's not necessarily to stimulate the economy as much as to help the economy grow out of the doldrums once the vaccine is discovered, without having prolonged impacts from bankruptcy. So let me use the rest of the time to talk a little bit about long-term impact of pandemics. Pandemics historically have always had long-term consequences. I tend to like to read about Roman history, and the Cyprian plague in Rome, for example, had very long-term consequences. This plague in the 3rd century led to a wave of external conflicts, internal political instability, inflation, and redrawing of the empire's boundaries, and an eventual relocation of the empire's capital from Rome to Constantinople, along with the adoption of a new religion, Christianity. So that's an example of a epidemic that had long-term consequences. Perhaps what we have to look forward to is not so drastic, but I do think that there will be some long-term effects from this pandemic. For one, what we see is that companies have taken the opportunity to do much more digitization of their processes, particularly in healthcare, as well as investing in automation. And these investments could have been made over the past 10 years, but companies are taking advantage of the opportunity to do so now. In addition, regulatory change by the government has facilitated making these investments. What that means is that in the aftermath of the pandemic, what we have done now is provided a recipe for higher productivity growth, particularly in advanced economies, which have been experiencing a deterioration of productivity growth for over the past couple decades, if not longer, depending on your perspective. So that's one thing to look forward to on a positive note in the aftermath of the pandemic, which is much more rapid productivity growth because of the types of investments that have been made across companies. Second, long-term impact, and this is more speculative because we don't know, but you can imagine that that it's possible that what we have experienced over the past 40 years, which is very rapid urbanization may actually slow down, if not completely reverse. What you see here is the change in payroll by metro size in the US, where you see that the largest reductions in employment have actually occurred in cities, and many people have moved out. It's quite likely that what we've done is made it clear that many people can continue to work from home and don't necessarily need to live so close to work. And as a consequence, we may see a slowdown in urbanization, as well as a globalization of the labor market, which means that the difference in wages between, say, New York City and rural Montana or rural Vermont may not be as different in the future as we see them today, because somebody in rural Vermont will be able to work more or less at a job in New York City. And it also means that the rural Vermont real estate prices will increase relative to the New York City real estate prices in the future, if you anticipate this slowdown in urbanization to take place. A third long-term consequence is the fiscal stress resulting from the pandemic. What you could see in the case of the US is that we are essentially at the World War II level in terms of gross domestic product as a proportion of GDP. In contrast to World War II, we were approaching World War II levels prior to the pandemic, and we were doing so in large part because of a lot of unfunded liabilities that were continuing to build up for the elderly. The pandemic has accelerated that process, and an unknown looking forward that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A if you're interested is how this accumulation of debt will be resolved in the foreseeable future, and whether it will result in a slowdown of global economic growth. The fourth long-term impact, I mentioned productivity improvements due to digitization, automation. What we've seen during the pandemic is unprecedented levels of government intervention in the financial markets, in particular providing debt relief to many businesses. Rolling that back will be challenging, and to the extent that it is not done appropriately, what we might end up with are many, what many call zombie businesses, and this is a term coined in the aftermath of the Japanese financial crisis. Zombie businesses are essentially businesses that should be dead, but that are staying alive because of government support, and their staying alive is causing a reduction in productivity because they utilize capital and employees that could be better used for other that could be better utilized for other more productive companies that are unable to enter because they don't have access to such cheap financing. So zombification is something to be concerned about as a long-term impact from the pandemic. And then a fifth long-term impact from the pandemic, and a final long-term impact, which has very important implications for emerging markets, is the potential reversal of the reduction in poverty that we have seen historically. This is going back to 2015, and what you could see here is the pre-COVID trend in reduction in poverty, global poverty, relative to the post-COVID trend, where what we're going to be seeing is countries that are poorer, that haven't been able to handle the pandemic as easily, suffering from from an economic crisis resulting from the pandemic, which can cause a reversal in the decades-long process of global poverty alleviation that we have been witnessing for the past 40 years. So that's an additional long-term risk to be thinking about. I'm going to now open it up for questions. Let me just recap. Over the last few minutes, I've discussed reasons why this recession is very different from anything we've ever seen. I've discussed a little bit of why the governments have done what they've done, and then finally we've discussed some of the long-term risks and long-term implications of the pandemic. So with that, I'd love to open it up to your questions for some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. There's so much great information here. Thank you for getting that all in 20 minutes. A lot of great questions came in, so let's kick that off, all right?
Absolutely.
All right. So the first one I want to ask is really about your process from Natalie. She says, is there a framework that you use to see major shifts in macroeconomics when you're scanning and reading the news?
That's a very good question. I think that the one way to think about macroeconomics is that sometimes you can get certain indications of what will happen by looking at specific types of data that tend to be leading indicators, meaning that they tend to lead the cycle. So if you want to try to figure out if we're entering a recession, you would look at specific types of data. Some of it is financial, like the yield curve, for example, or you can look at something called the Purchasing Managers Index, which is more manufacturing based, which tends to lead the cycle. So my process is to basically go through lots and lots of data on a daily basis. I subscribe to a newsletter. I look at that data, and I have some sense of whether something is reversing or accelerating based on looking at that data, looking at financial market data, and some data on production. What I will say is that it's a little bit harder to interpret those data these days because things are very different. Let me give you one example. Historically, for every recession, something like the PMI, the Purchasing Managers Index, which is a manufacturing index, would be leading the cycle. The reason is that it's the case that things pick up in manufacturing before they pick up in services and everything else. Turns out that PMIs are doing very well these days. Part of the reason why that is because services have been much more hit during this recession than manufacturing, because manufacturing can be more easily socially distanced. Another way of putting it is, I'm not sure that we can use that indicator as much nowadays to forecast the future, to tell us where we're going as in the past, because of the fact that this is a very unique recession. And in particular, in the case of manufacturing services, it's hit services much more relative to manufacturing than in all previous recessions. So we have to be very careful. Also, we have to be very careful interpreting what's going on in the stock market because of the tremendous amount of government support that we've been seeing across the world, fiscal and monetary support. So just to give you an idea, I'm happy to email you offline some particular sources that I look at, newsletters that I subscribe to, if you are interested.
Perfect, thank you. So many more questions have come in. Natalia is asking, you mentioned in the beginning of the webinar changes in consumer habits. How do you think that it influences the labor market, particularly the e-commerce market?
That's a very good question. If you think about e-commerce relative to brick and mortar, and if you think about, if you can think about it, I tend to think about something like e-commerce versus brick and mortar in terms of, is it advantageous for worker? Is it a substitute for labor, or is it, how does it change the overall demand for labor? That's the way to put it. And how does it change the demand for high skilled versus low skilled labor? So the way I would think about e-commerce versus, say, brick and mortar is that that's sort of a structural shift towards not having as many employees as before. So it's a boost in productivity in retail, but it also means you can do more with fewer employees. It's also a shift towards more high-skilled employees versus low-skilled employees, because to run an e-commerce website, you kind of need different types of employees to do that. So my view of it is that it's a shift in the labor market where it could actually dampen labor demand in that particular sector, but it's a relative increase in demand for the high-skilled workers in that who know something about computers and logistics, who can facilitate that process of e-commerce. E-commerce has been a thriving area during this time. I would also say another thing is that, even though commercial real estate has been suffering, if you look at warehouses, the warehousing business is doing great. So we do see pockets of activity that are doing great these days, such as warehouses. Scott.
All right, super. So Rudra asks, what are drivers of increased debt? And what are examples of how businesses should plan?
I assume that is a question. Do you know if the question is about public debt or private debt, or I can assume. Okay, so I would say, so let's assume it's public debt. The big drivers of increases in public debt are the stimulus, fiscal stimulus that many governments have been engaged in. That's the immediate impact. And actually, in terms of, as a proportion of relative to the size of the economy, the US stimulus has been through the roof, larger than any country, I think, next to Japan. And then if the current proposal goes through, it'll blow it out of the water. So that's really the reason why the debt is expanding more recently. If we go back more historically, at least at advanced economies, the driver of the debt in advanced economies, in my view, is long-term forces, not just in the US, but across advanced economies where you see spending outpacing revenue. And the reason is that the spending, because people are getting old and there's more and more spending for programs for the elderly that are not being matched by increases in tax revenue. And that's happening across advanced economies. And that's for the debt that we see. There's also hidden debt, which comes in the form of promises that have been made for future generations, which we can perceive as debt. That also applies in the case of the US for unfunded pension liabilities at the more local level. What does it imply for businesses? What it implies for businesses is sort of, you got to think about the risks that come along with this high debt. And I think about those risks in two ways. You got to think about how are those debts resolved? And many tend to think that it's all inflation. I saw a question early on in the chat about inflation. Many people say, oh, there's lots of debt, it'll be inflationary. That's possible, but it's not necessary. What's true is that in the aftermath of World War II, we did see lots of inflation, reaching, I think, 22% in the late 1940s. We saw inflation again in the 70s, all eroding the value of debt. But the real way in which government debt as a proportion of GDP declined in the aftermath of World War II was through a combination of economic growth and financial repression. And by financial repression, I mean the government basically regulating financial institutions into holding government debt as a way to artificially depress interest rates. And that could be what we see. And so in a world like that, you have to think about the consequences of financial repression. We have an administration coming in now, which is more likely to regulate the financial, is going to be more pro-regulation than the previous administration. So that could be a way in which we sort of see depressed interest rates for a very long time coming hand in hand with more regulation. Another thing to think about is that a way in which the debt can be resolved is through future austerity, future taxation. And it's the prospect of higher future taxes, such as a sudden, an anticipated increase in corporate taxes, say in 2026, when the 2017, when many parts of the 2017 tax plan expire in the US. The prospect of higher future taxes, that by itself is a risk that businesses face. That by itself can dampen economic activity right now. And so some of the risks that businesses can face involve financial repression, higher future taxes, not necessarily high inflation per se, because we haven't seen a lot of inflation recently because of the Fed's strong commitment as well as the ECB's strong commitment to low inflation. Scott?
All right. I'm going to ask that we, with your permission, just because there's so much great questions coming in, great information, we go a few minutes over.
Sure, no problem.
For those of you who can stay with us, we hope you do. We have so many great questions coming in. I'm going to continue with Professor Yared. So, okay, Pierre, what are some examples of this term raised a lot of questions. So what are examples of what government can do to avoid zombification?
To avoid zombification, man, that's a very difficult question to think about. A lot of it is it's the at the end of the day, it ends up having to do with the operational details of how these bailouts were made and how they are rolled back. And I would say that without thinking about specific examples and specific details, probably the best way to go about this is to not succumb to political interference, because anyone who is receiving the government bailout will want to continue to do so. And so probably the best principle to keep in mind for governments that want to avoid that is that it's best to think about an entire sector holistically versus specific large companies which might be the recipients of government aid. But that's a very good question. I also think that in general, reducing barriers to entry for startup firms is something to always prize. Many emerging markets have have done very well at improving their own dynamism, their own, World Bank doing business scores. An advanced economy like the US has plenty that it can do to facilitate more dynamism and innovation through a couple of means. One is to think about changes to regulation that can make it easier for new startup firms to enter. We've seen startups decline for 40 years, although we may be seeing an uptick now because of the pandemic has actually caused a lot more entrepreneurial activity because of the opportunity. And the other thing to think about is moving forward is the way in which at least in the case of the U.S. government will be enforcing antitrust laws that might facilitate more innovation and more entry by disrupting firms. So those are ways to help on the other side to prevent zombification.
Let's do two more questions. One of them is more a predictive question, and the last one will be a final one, more of a, what can we do next type of question. First one is, which sectors and which regions do you imagine will grow in 2021, 2022 as we go forward?
That is a good question. So it depends on whether we're talking about the stock market or the real economy. So let me not think about the stock market because I'm not very good at predicting that. Let's think about the real economy. And remember, we're talking about growth, right? So if you think about growth, what you want to do is to think about what's been the most devastated by the pandemic and what's the most likely to reverse quickly as a consequence of renormalization. Now, you may not think that that's necessarily travel because there might be some long-term effects of that. But for sure, anything that involves, anything, I would say that in terms of growth, I would say that anything that involves face-to-face entertainment in congested spaces, amusement parks, things like that, of that nature, domestically, the domestic entertainment, I would say that those are the areas that are going to be growing the most rapidly in the aftermath of the pandemic. So that's one thing you can think about. The other consideration you might want to think about is which businesses have made the most investments during the pandemic for the post-pandemic world in terms of increasing their productivity. That sort of depends on the sector, but what I would look at companies that have made those specific investments, and those might be the ones that we see growing, where they've used the downtime now to make those important investments into their future productivity. Right. What was the follow? The follow-up was which regions? Okay. So in terms of regions, if we want to be optimists, we may think that if we want to be optimists and if we think that we're going to have a rapid bounce back, it might be that the post-pandemic world looks more like the 2000s than the 2010s. And if that's the case, then we will see some more rapid economic growth in emerging markets, a commodity, more demand for commodities. And there are good reasons for thinking that might be the case, which is that there are a lot of structural reasons for growth that are there that weren't there in 2010. The reason being that we were in the aftermath of a financial crisis. So if a financial crisis is avoided, which is what it looks like, I think that we might be in for a situation where we see more growth in emerging markets. Now, which emerging markets? I think that always depends on the specifics of who is running the government, because who runs the government in emerging markets often drives the growth in emerging markets, and it's a very simple type of calculus there. So we'd have to look more deeply at specific examples. Scott?
Great. All right. So one final question. More of a what can they do next? Keep the energy going after the webinar. And so how do you think that for the people that are watching now, they should look and think about macroeconomics in terms of pandemics or other commensurate future events? How should we look at it?
That's a really good question. I usually tend to, what I tell people when they think about macro is that if you're running a business, it's one thing to think about, interest rates have gone up, or there's a risk of interest rates going up, or there's a risk of a recession and so on, and how does it impact me? But I think that if you really want to think about macro and how it impacts your business, that's only step one. It's more important to also consider sort of how it impacts everything else in the economy, how it impacts all of your customers, all of your suppliers, and everyone else. And the reason for doing that is because there's a lot of other effects you may not anticipate. And those additional knock-on effects create additional opportunities as well as risks for you. And so my one piece of advice in thinking about this is don't be narrowly focused on, what does it mean for my business directly? Think about the overall picture, because there's a lot of other things you might not be considering that will have knock-on effects and present new opportunities for you. So that's my 2 cents.
Great. Thank you. It's a great key takeaway. Thank you so much for joining us today. A ton of great information. And we look forward to your upcoming online class, Global Strategy, in March. Professor Yared, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Scott.
And thank you to all of you for joining us today. We hope you remain safe and well. Thank you.